Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about body modifications and job interviews. So specifically, I'm thinking here about tattoos and piercings, because this is a concern for a lot of people. We have an increasing percentage of Americans who have tattoos or piercings. The current generations, millennials and Gen Z, are the most tattooed generations in American history. And this raises some interesting questions in terms especially of job interviews, because traditionally tattoos and visible piercing, now I'm not talking for women just a single sort of ear piercing or something like that, or just one ear pierced for man, something like that. I'm talking like the large loops in your ears, or nose rings, lip rings, any of that kind of stuff that's less traditional. What do you do for a job interview when those body modifications are visible? This depends on a number of factors. One is the kind of job that this is, the particular office culture of this company or this business, whatever it is. One is your personal stance toward this. So these are important components. So, like, I've had students in business writing classes ask whether, for instance, the student should take their nose ring out before going into a job interview. That's a tricky question because it depends on those different factors. So one thing to consider is, how dedicated are you to being upfront about having those body modifications? Sometimes it's not that big of an issue to a person to take out a ring or to cover tattoos or something like this. I have 8 tattoos, but generally speaking, they're not that visible when I'm dressed for work. I also tend to dress fairly conservatively in terms of work. I like to wear long sleeve shirts. I like to wear suits or sport coats or things like this. But I have wrist tattoos. So I've got one right there and I've got one right there. And these may be visible. I'm not going to make any special effort to hide these, in part because they're meaningful to me. And there's also a component of me, and I think of many other people with tattoos or piercings who might say, you know what, if you're not going to hire me because I have tattoos, this is probably not a place I would be happy working anyway. So part of it, again, it depends on your particular perspective on it. Like, if you are dedicated to being upfront with tattoos, piercings, whatever it is, be true to yourself. Part of this also depends on what your body modifications are and how visible they are likely to be, not only for the interview, but while you're on the job itself. So if, for instance, you have a belly button ring or a tattoo on, say, your hip or something like this, it's unlikely that that's going to be visible in most professions. So that's not really going to show up in the interview. Whereas if you have, say, a neck tattoo, I don't know, spider web or something on your neck, if you've got wrist tattoos like I do, if you have large gauge ear piercings, something like this, those things are going to be much more difficult to hide, even when wearing clothes appropriate for an interview. So that's something that you want to be aware of as well. You may not necessarily have an easy luxury if you've got knuckle tattoos or something. It may not be particularly easy to hide those body modifications if you were inclined to do so. So that's another component of it. But the other things that you want to be thinking about are the industry that you want to work in, and the culture of the particular place that you're interviewing, because those are going to be big factors in determining how open the interviewers are to body modifications. So in a lot of industries, increasingly, people are not that concerned about tattoos. So if you work in academia, for instance, if you're in the humanities like I am, or the arts or something like this, nobody cares about tattoos. Get tattoos all over. Nobody gives a shit. If you're working in a more traditional field, particularly in a position where you're going to have to work with clients or customers who are likely to be more traditional. So I'm thinking now about like banking or in the legal field. If you're in a more conservative type industry, visible body modifications may be more of a problem, either for your employer or for their clients. This is not a fair assessment, but it is unfortunately true. People judge people with tattoos, people with visible piercings, things like this, in part because there are some unsavory histories that go along, especially with tattooing in Western culture. Associations with gangs, for instance, associations with sailors going from port to port, etc., etc. Obviously, this is not true of the overwhelming majority of tattooed people, including myself, but it is still a stereotype that some people have, particularly more conservative people and people who you're more likely to have as clients if you're in, say, upscale finance or things like that. So that is something to be concerned about. And employers may not want to hire people, employers in those industries may not want to hire people with visible body modifications because the employer may be concerned about how clients or customers will perceive that employee. So that's something to think about. The other component of it is the culture of the individual employer, whether that's a business or a nonprofit, NGO, government agency, whatever it is. Different companies have different attitudes toward things. I imagine, for instance, that a very sort of uptight accounting firm or law firm or something like this would be reluctant to have a tattooed employee. Morgan Stanley, for instance, Wells Fargo in the sort of upper management levels, companies like this that are very old school, particularly in again, fields like finance, fields like law, fields like economics, banking, things like this. They may be very reluctant to have that. But there will also be individual companies that are very, very open about it. My sister, for instance, works at Epic Industries in Madison, Wisconsin, and they are very, very open in terms of what kinds of body mods they allow their employees to have. They don't really have any sort of code whatsoever, as far as I can tell. So tattoos would be fine. Piercings are fine, etc., etc. So a lot of like startups and tech companies and things like this that are more sort of relaxed and more modern, hip, etc., etc., are going to be much more open to this. So that's another thing that you would want to determine when figuring out how you want to present yourself in an interview. Now, the last sort of caveat with this, or the last thing that's worth noting in terms of presenting yourself for an interview specifically, is that when you are going for an interview, you should be presenting yourself as an interviewee. And that's a different thing than presenting yourself as an employee or presenting yourself as a colleague. An interviewee should be more formal than a colleague or an employee, an interviewee should dress a level up from what you would expect to dress, or from how you would expect to dress while doing that actual job. And I will talk about how to dress for interviews in another video. This one I want to keep focused on the question of body mods and their visibility. But because that's the case, so in some jobs, like jobs in the trades, for instance, carpentry, plumbing, electrician, mechanics, things like that, I would say you want to dress business casual, which means at the very least a polo shirt. Although I would generally recommend button down. But if you're wearing a polo shirt or something like that, it may have long sleeves. And so any tattoos on your forearms will be visible. If you wear, on the other hand, a button-down shirt with long sleeves, that should cover most tattoos. Again, anything on your hands, knuckles, anything like that will still be visible. Anything on your face, head, neck area will potentially be visible. But generally speaking, when you're going for an interview, I would recommend wearing long sleeves. That tends to come across as more professional, and so that's going to cover more. That's going to cover more things up anyway. So just not necessarily in terms of like I want to hide my tattoos or whatever it is, but in terms of just dressing appropriately for an interview as such. It's likely that a lot of your tattoos are going to be covered anyway. Piercings, I have less of a good sense of because I don't have any piercings, but again, you want to think about it in the same terms. Like if it's nose, lip, eyebrow, a lot of ear piercings, heavy ear piercings, large gauge, whatever it is, consider how you want to present yourself. And with that, you do have more choices in terms of taking them out or whatever it is. You have less professional clothing that's likely to cover those. So you do likely have to make more of a choice with that. But again, you want to think about how you might be perceived and how you might be perceived specifically by the people in this industry and this company, because they're going to be making the choice about whether or not to extend a job offer. And so you want to make sure that you're meeting their standards of professionalism, but also that you're being honest about who you are and that you're not attempting to deceive them, because not only are they potentially going to be unhappy if they think they're hiring someone without tattoos and they find out you got full sleeves, for instance. If they're the kind of company that's not going to hire someone with tattoos and you have and love your tattoos, again, do you want to work there? So you want to make these decisions. And again, the top three things to think about for me are how you feel about your own body modifications and how public you want them to be with a potential employer, what the industry tends to lean toward, and what that individual company culture, that individual company's culture tends to allow for.